Well, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our first speaker, my good friend, Mark Aronchick. Mark is a partner in the law firm of Hangley, Aronchick, Siegel, Hudkin, and Schiller in Philadelphia. He was the youngest solicitor of the city of Philadelphia. He's past chancellor of the Pennsylvania Bar Association. He has been a leading litigator in advancing basic civil liberties and civil rights for the LGBT community, as well as the process of protecting democracy. He was the lead litigator in the cases dealing with gerrymandering in the state of Pennsylvania. But relevant to us today is that Mark was the lawyer who litigated the first challenge to the overwhelming victory of Joe Biden in the presidential election. And he was the first litigant representing the state of Pennsylvania, wherein Rudy Giuliani was representing Donald Trump. There were 59 subsequent cases, but this first case set the tone. And there's no doubt that Mark was involved in the strategies of the subsequent cases. But he was the first leader to put his finger in the dam and hold back the tide. And had he lost, God knows what the world would have been like. So it's really an honor to hear from him. And the arc of today will be beginning in the courtroom in central Pennsylvania, going to the US Congress, one of the leaders of the United States intelligence community and Homeland Security, Suzanne Spalding, and then Kim Campbell, who's the former Prime Minister of Canada, talking about America's role in the world. But first we begin in a courtroom in central Pennsylvania. Mark, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy and Jonathan, and welcome to all of you. If you're anything like me, this is one of your first big moves out of the shadows. You're actually going back into the real world, and that's the same for me. And so I'll always remember one of my first big steps into the real world was here with you today. Let me set the scene a little bit about the 2020 elections. A lot of you, I think, probably know the details. Maybe you don't want to remember the details. Coming into the 2020 elections, just about everybody knew that Pennsylvania was ground zero. Which way Pennsylvania went was going to be pretty much decisive. Other states, of course, were important as we went along: Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, but it really all was centered in Pennsylvania for the longest time. And there was a real concern pre-pandemic. We're talking about the early part of 2020. A real concern in the Trump campaign on whether and how they could duplicate their 2016 surprising victory in Pennsylvania. Now, coming into the 2020 year, none of us knew anything about a pandemic, right? I mean, some of us were watching the news in January, what was going on in China. My wife was all over it in February, but very few people were listening to her. We weren't really focused on that. And coming into that year, the Pennsylvania legislature had passed a new statute, bipartisan, overwhelming bipartisan, Republican and Democrat. And in that statute, it, for the first time in Pennsylvania, broadened the notion of mail-in voting to what was called no excuse mail-in voting. So the first use of that new voting tool or method in Pennsylvania was going to be the primary in 2020. And no one believed that there would be a huge, overwhelming use of mail-in voting because we're a machine voting state. People are used to that. That's how they campaign. That's how the system works. People thought, you know, there'll be a greater use, but it'll be something we can look at, study, see how it works. Then the pandemic, right? And all of a sudden, nobody wants to go outside, no less go into a voting booth or touch a screen. Remember you wipe down everything before you even touch the screen, or walk inside an enclosed space. All of a sudden, there was just an eruption of the need for mail-in voting if we were going to have a real thorough election in Pennsylvania. And the people who run the election in Pennsylvania at the state level and at the county levels, who, by the way, were the real patriots in this story, they worked overtime to implement this new system. But everybody knew that since it was new, there would be litigation around it. Of course there would be. It's a new statute. Every new statute has some ambiguity in it. How does this work? How does that work? I mean, people knew there would be some litigation around that new statute. I have been in very, very many big public cases in my life, and our firm does a lot of, big business litigation, that kind of thing. And I do that. But I am quite well known for handling and getting involved in big mega cases, the big public disputes. And so it wasn't a surprise to me that the governor and the big counties in Pennsylvania turned to me and my colleagues in the firm to get ready to defend the implementation of this new statute. And it's important for you to understand that I was representing throughout all of this the neutrals, the umpires, the people who were running the process, the patriots. I wasn't partisan on one side or the other. That's where I was. And the idea was to get that election moving efficiently, have it work. But starting in the primary season, and I can't go through all of the details in a short time, but if anybody has questions, I will. But starting in the primary season, it became evident to us that not just the Republican side, a little bit the Democratic side, but mostly the Republican side, were looking at the ambiguities in a different way. Not how do we make this system work, but how do we throw crowbars into the system? Because any demographic or any statistical look at mail-in voting in other places in other states shows that you have a larger turnout in the urban areas when you have mail-in voting. Democratic areas, even though it's used all the way across Pennsylvania. The idea was, well, why make it easier for people in the urban areas to vote? Why make it so much easier? And so we started to see litigation that was in the nature of kind of exaggerated challenge in the primary. We hadn't even run an election yet. We were already hearing in lawsuits and in litigation that it was going to be fraudulent. It was going to be defective. It was going to be a disaster. And we're starting to hear this. We went through that first round of litigation and established that it wasn't a disaster and it wasn't a problem. The biggest case in this pre-primary season was brought by the Trump campaign in Western Pennsylvania in federal court. And they drew a recently appointed Trump judge, meaning Trump appointed judge in Western Pennsylvania, a young guy, maybe 39, 40 years old, been on the bench for less than a year. And I think they were very happy until they weren't happy, because that judge, in a compressed way over that summer of 2020, managed an election better than I think I've seen any judge, I've been at this for 50 years, anywhere, handling a major case with national visibility in a very fair way, and wrote hundreds of pages of opinions saying that basically most of the complaints the Trump campaign were raising about mail-in voting were wrong. There were no constitutional violations. There weren't going to be any of these problems. And so we went into the general election period in September, October, thinking, okay, most of the underbrush is cleared out. Little did we know. Starting in a couple of weeks before the election, actually a couple months before the election from the President Trump and a lot of his followers, but particularly ginned up in a couple of weeks before the election, was you watch Pennsylvania, bad things happen in Philadelphia. This is going to be the big steal. This is where the fraud's going to occur. This is where the problems are. Dead people will vote. They're going to stuff mail-in ballot boxes. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. That's what you heard. Well, which had no basis in any reality that was actually going on at the time. None. And they seized on, a reality in the way we run elections, which is that the machine votes are counted that night, but the mail-in votes, and the provisional votes, there's other kinds of votes, they are more slowly counted over the days, sometimes weeks after an election. That is true in any election you have ever been in, anywhere, anytime. That's just the way it is. But their mantra was, we will show you that we won the election on election night, and in the days after, they're going to steal it. And that's because the machine votes in Pennsylvania favor the Republicans, and they did in the primary. And so they figured that even though maybe only half the vote, because half the vote was mail-in, half the vote would be counted by the night of the election, they would be winning. And of course that was true. They were ahead on the night of the election on half the vote, the machine vote, which came. Pennsylvania has 67 counties. Most of them are rural counties. They count, they have machines, they send it in, boom. So from election day forward, I and my colleagues in the firm, I was a legal lawyer, were involved in a circus. That's all I can tell you. It was just a circus. On election day, a group of notables showed up where we were counting the mail-in votes in our convention center. I think it was Roy Lewandowski, Eric Trump, Pam Bondi, Jenna Ellis. These names all are familiar to you. Like giving press conference outside the counting, they're stealing it in there. Nobody can see what's going on in there. They're taking it away from us in there. And we, and we were transparent. There were live stream feeds of the counting room, 24/7. And there were observers allowed all around the perimeter of the counting room whenever anybody was counting. That didn't matter. That was the story. And then as the vote was coming in favoring Joe Biden, the weekend and faster than they had ever expected, because we were ready for that. And we had counting machines, we had extra people working 3 shifts, we had a lot of things going on. Coming into that weekend after the election, it was clear that Biden was pulling ahead by 80,000 votes, a lot of votes in any election. There wasn't enough that there wouldn't be a mandatory recount. I mean, the margin, very comfortable margin. And we were going to announce the unofficial certification of the vote that weekend. And so out comes Rudy Giuliani. Everybody here knows Rudy Giuliani. He pops out of the woodwork, basically, his team. They park themselves in the Four Seasons Hotel next to my office. The Four Seasons Hotel next to my office. And they announce, come to the Four Seasons. There's going to be a press conference about how this election is being stolen. Simultaneous with where they, at the time they knew that the certification, the unofficial certification was going to be announced, and that Biden was, the counting's done, Biden's ahead. The problem is the Four Seasons doesn't allow those kinds of press conferences, and something, some staffer found some place called the Four Seasons Total Landscaping, which was up by the Ben Franklin, I think where the Betsy Road, one of the bridges up there, and underneath, like next door to a porn shop and across the street from a crematorium, and on a Sunday closed, a big chain link fence behind it, flowers, I guess, little trees, manure, all the stuff that a landscaping company has. And a tiny little street jammed in. And we sent a person up there to watch this silliness. And it was that. I mean, it was Rudy, just really getting all exercised about, he's got the goods, he's got the information, he's going to show everybody how this election was stolen, just, his typical Rudy stuff. And a couple days later, there's a lawsuit. This one, though, not in Western PA with their Trump judge, who's not a Trump judge at all, he's an amazing judge. He was appointed, but he's an amazing judge. And that's, by the way, the subtext where I'm going to get to when I wrap this, about our judiciary and our rule of law and what really held up. But here they went to, they found a venue in Central PA up at Williamsport, where maybe some of you know that we have the Little League World Series in Williamsport. There isn't, it's a nice little town. There isn't a lot that goes on there. There's one federal judge who was a very conservative judge. In his day, he was a Federalist Society person, he Republican through and through. I guess they thought they were happy that they got it, I guess. Because of all the cases that they were ginning up and bringing at that time in Michigan, in Arizona, and Georgia, Pennsylvania was still ground zero. And Rudy Giuliani decided his only court appearance, and if you go back to the record, it was his only court appearance, was going to be in this case in federal court in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And I was one of the two lawyers, but pretty much, turned out the main lawyer, who were going to be defending against Rudy's attacks on the election. And he rolled in with all the fanfare you can imagine. They were all there, the whole group, the people you're familiar with. And there were 8,000 dedicated phone lines, most of them, I think, filled. There were streaming services. There was one just dedicated to the press. It was really, very closely watched case because Rudy was now coming in with the goods. And he went on and made a presentation that was one of the most deplorable presentations I've seen in an American courtroom. And I got up and said so. And I just spent a long time ripping apart his presentation for what it was, which was just another version of the first season's Total Landscaping press conference in an American courtroom. And, and then as it went on, Rudy conceded. He first said, I got fraud. I'm going to show fraud. I want all the mail-in votes in Philadelphia and Allegheny disqualified, like 600,000 votes. They're all disqualified. And there was a mafia cabal that got together to run this thing. And it's conspiracy of big mayors, and I think he even added in some countries. I mean, it was like a whole thing. And I took it apart and then set it up. And then when the judge asked some questions, he said, "Mr. Giuliani, are you presenting a fraud case? Because if you are, I really want to know what is the fraud. Are you presenting a fraud case?" He said, "Well, yes, I am." He said, "Oh, okay, then can we talk about it?" And they go, "Well, no, I'm not. It's not a fraud case." Judge, it's not a fraud case. What is it? He said, "Well, it's an unconstitutional case." I mean, this was really remarkably poor and bad. Some of his presentation features in the New York bar interim suspension of Rudy Giuliani's law license in New York. You can go get the opinion and read what the New York bar folks at that level, I think it's being appealed, thought of Rudy's presentation in Pennsylvania. But here's the point. The judge, first of all, I have been in many, as I said, many spotlights. I couldn't believe this. This, I'm not getting emails from all over the world about thank you for saving democracy and doing this thing and that thing. And the judge, I think, was so offended by what was in front of him, this Republican and conservative judge, that he wrote an opinion, and part of it was just uncharacteristic of this judge. He said, you know, what has been presented to me in this complaint is nothing more than a stitched together Frankenstein monster. And, you know, they then appealed that. They actually thought they were going to turn it over on it. They want to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So then they got, a couple of days later, everything was expedited, accelerated. The Court of Appeals were 3 judges, all Republicans, and the one who wrote the opinion was another Trump-appointed judge who wrote in different language cases that seek to overturn the will of the voters. Here, you know, maybe 1.5 million voters, ought to have law and facts on its side. This case has neither. And so here's what came about. I mean, we had about 20 plus cases of those 60 that Jonathan was talking about in Pennsylvania alone. We won all but one, and the one that we lost didn't matter. We just didn't want to waste our time with it. The cases around the country were similar. The importance of this case, and I want to say that in Pennsylvania, we had federal and state cases. Of all the federal cases, I think all but one wound up with a Republican appointed judge. All but one. And they all went against the attacks and challenges on the campaign. And as I said, some of them were appointed by President Trump himself. And if you went up the system, the Third Circuit, the Court of Appeals, similar, all rejected. The U.S. Supreme Court, all rejected. We had, you know, if there's ever a proof point of an overwhelming rejection of an idea, you know, a stolen fourth election, it is what happened in that month and a half or so from the election to the December 14th certifications of the Electoral College. And so we all felt really good. We defended the system, the patriots, we defended the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. Everything that I believe in deeply proved itself. It was a total proof point. It all was great. But the problem, of course, was that there was round 2, right? After their whole effort to try to overturn something in court, where you go, failed. Then we see round 2. And round 2 led to the insurrection, right? Now, I do not take from them that there's a flaw or some problem in our system, because I think that, and I've taught law in China, Beijing. I've been around the world in many places, and there is no system that works better than ours. There's just no system that has a better chance of promoting the rule of law. There's no system that has a more independent judiciary. We have flaws and we can fix them, but there is no system that's better. And we showed the world through all that litigation that point. But I don't think that for all the civics classes that we've all had and all of the things we read about our system, nobody has really studied what happens if after you do what you're supposed to do, go to court, try to put on a case, try to put on evidence, the people who lose reject the whole process. We've never really, I mean, like, my head's exploded. Like, why would we want to study that? Like, we believe, we buy into our process, right? That's what we're supposed to, that's what we think, right? So yeah, we've had anarchists and things in the United States history. I know all that. But if the very leadership rejects the process that we all believe, then what happens? Is there something about our system that can self-correct that? And I believe there is. And I think we're watching it unfold. Another speaker, in Jamie Raskin's, in the January 6th committee. I think we're watching it unfold in the post-2020 litigation that they keep trying to bring in Pennsylvania. We've had more litigation in 2021 and just in 2022. I'll give you just one, absurd example. Remember I told you mail-in voting was, a statute was passed bipartisan, overwhelming bipartisan, right? Well, I think it's 16 or 15 of the Republicans who voted for that statute in 2019 brought a case at the end of last year, 2021, saying that that statute is unconstitutional under Pennsylvania law. They voted for the statute, and now they say it's unconstitutional. It's crazy. We argued the case a month or so ago. I believe that our Pennsylvania Supreme Court will not go in that direction. I think we will right our ship again. And I think that the processes that we're seeing play out will work. Some of the state legislatures around the country have chosen to go in weird directions, but let's see how it works with the rest of our processes, our court system, our legislature, and fundamentally, I hope, our media and our voting public. I am not a pessimist about this, but we are all in a part of history where we're going to actually, we're living through history now to see how that question that I just posed works, which is, after you do what you're supposed to do, and the courts speak, and that's over, and then you elect a president, what happens in your democracy if the leaders reject that process? Does your democracy still work? We're going to live through that for the rest of this year, maybe right into 2024. But I think it's going to work.